red baiting that matches anything on the right in its crudity and obligatory persistence. My friend Noam Chomsky, just in Z Magazine, talked about those leftists who ride into power on the backs of the masses and turn into communist thugs. Norm, you're not Newt, you're Norm. What are you talking like that for? Communists, we're told, hunger for power rather than wanting the power to end hunger. Those of us who refused over those years to join in the Soviet bashing, which by the way reached rather frothy levels by the Reagan years, we were branded as Soviet apologists and Stalinists, even if we disliked Stalin and his autocratic system of rule. My real sin, I decided, which I plan to commit again tonight, and which I've already committed, is that I questioned rather than uncritically embraced the media propaganda images and stereotypes about existing communism. My other sin, which I also plan to commit, is that I also said and still say that there were positive things to consider about existing communist systems. Regarding the Soviet Union, here was a nation that threw back and destroyed the Nazi beast and sustained 80% of the Allied losses in the war, 22 million dead. I thought that that was a debt that humanity owed the Soviet people. Here was a nation that in 3 decades made industrial advances equal to what it took capitalism a century to accomplish, while feeding and schooling its children rather than working them 14 hours a day, as the capitalists did during the Industrial Revolution, and as capitalists are still doing today in many parts of the world. Here was a nation that provided vital assistance, material, military, medical, armed assistance to liberation movements in Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, South Africa, Angola, and other countries. As Nelson Mandela pointed out, I heard him on a TV show in Washington when he was visiting here in 1990. And the announcer, of course, was doing his usual things. Well, the U.S. has done this and the Soviets have done that, so we know both. He's doing the balancing act. You have to always do that. Dumping on both of them. Said, what do you say, Mr. Mandela? And Mandela said, please do not denounce the Soviet Union. They have been our great friends and given us valuable aid in the struggle against apartheid and racism. Only Mandela could get away with saying that on national TV. Here was one of the few countries that, for all its injustices and dysfunctional structures, and I am going to talk about those things, be patient, did guarantee its citizens some minimal economic security. Here was another positive thing that's never mentioned. A country that performed the rescue and survival of 3 million Soviet Jews during World War II. I mean, many Jews were killed in World War II because many Russians, period, because they were just in the war and fighting. But 3 million Soviet Jewish civilians were saved, which is more than you can say happened to Jews in Poland and most of Eastern Europe, in Germany and Croatia. Left anti-communism was, and it still is, as orthodox and dogmatic as the mainstream or the more extreme McCarthyite varieties, in that it doesn't tolerate anything positive being uttered about existing communist systems, except possibly Cuba. For some reason, and the Cuban system is exactly a Soviet system. A one-party, women's federations, the role of the trade union movement, the role of the youth groups is exactly the same model. But Cuba is kind of looked at warmly, which is nice. I guess we would be grateful for small things. Left anti-communism expects nothing less than a blanket condemnation of communist countries as Stalinist monstrosities, historic and moral aberrations. I prefer what psychologists call differential object appraisal. That you look at something and you see it in very differentiated things. Some things good, some things not so good. Regardless of what the political orthodoxy is, regardless of what the advice is about maintaining your credibility, and so making sure that you say these other things. In reaction to this anti-Sovietism and anti-communism, many communists overcompensated by going to the other extreme, by refraining from uttering or even tolerating listening to a critical word about the autocratic or problematic features of the Soviet Union. Problem-ridden features. I got into more than one altercation trying to make a criticism of the Soviet system with friends and acquaintances in the Communist Party. I can recall a friend of mine, a party member here in the U.S., who assured me that there was no prostitution in the Soviet Union. I mean, here was a woman, she was in her mid-40s, a grown woman of some experience, saying to me that in this nation of, 300 million people, there was no prostitution. I couldn't believe it. I remember when I was in the Soviet Union in Moscow, the guide saying to me, there is no prostitution in my country. Another grown, mature woman. And I said to her, there may be no prostitution in your country, but there's a hell of a lot of it here in this hotel. Let's get real. Come on, let's get real. We're talking about this very messy, imperfect thing called a human being. And the social organizations they developed, which were even more messy and imperfect than they. Well, you know what her response was? She said, without batting an eye, she said, well, those women also have regular jobs during the day, I would like to know. Thereby giving new meaning to the term working girl. Some say that the upheavals in Eastern Europe don't constitute a defeat for socialism, because socialism never existed in those countries. What you had there was state capitalism, or some such thing. Well, whether we want to call them socialists or not is a matter of definition. Suffice it to say that they constituted something different from what existed in the profit-driven capitalist world, as the capitalists themselves were quick and persistent to recognize. First, the productive forces in these countries were not organized for capital gain and private enrichment, as with capitalism. Public ownership supplanted private ownership. The perks that were enjoyed by party and government elites were relatively modest compared to the elites in most civilizations. Yes, it's true, Soviet leaders like Yuri Andropov and Brezhnev had big dachas where they entertained foreign visitors. Yes, it's true, they had limousine services and they lived in fairly large apartments in a housing project specially set aside for government leaders near the Kremlin. I saw it. It's a big, ugly old, very inauspicious building. That's where the leaders of the Soviet Union lived. But it was larger than what ordinary Soviets would get. But nobody in the Soviet Union could hire the labor of others and extract great personal wealth from that labor. The degree of inherited wealth was also relatively modest and limited. The income spread between highest and lowest earners in the Soviet Union was about 3 or 4 to 1, as compared to 40 or 50 to 1 in the U.S. In fact, I did a little computation. If you compare Steve Forbes, multi-billionaire Steve Forbes' income to a poverty-level wage earner, the spread is more like 10,000 to 1, 10,000 times to 1. Furthermore, communist countries did not pursue the capital penetration of other countries. They didn't have a profit motive as their motive force. They didn't have a need to constantly find new investment opportunities to be able to invest more, to accumulate more, to invest more abroad as under capitalism. The Soviet Union's trade and aid relations were generally economically favorable to Eastern European nations, Cuba, and India. A real socialism, it's argued, would be controlled by the workers themselves through direct participation instead of being run by Leninists, Stalinists, Castroites, or other ill-willed, evil leaders and bureaucrats who betray revolutions, we hear. Well, unfortunately, this pure socialism view is profoundly ahistorical and non-falsifiable. By that I mean it remains untestable against the actualities of history. It compares an ideal against an imperfect reality, and sure enough, reality comes off a poor second. The pure socialist ideological anticipations remain untainted by existing practice. They don't explain how a complex revolutionary society could be built and secured, how priorities could be set, how survival could be achieved by just having the workers own and control everything. How do you expropriate enough surplus value to build an army to defend yourself against the invasion that comes? It's no surprise that the pure socialists support every revolution except the ones that succeed. The pure socialists usually blame the left for every defeat by the left.